All right, Guillermo, we are live recording. Let's kick it off with you've been around, you've done a number of different projects in your career. What was the motivation for your current business now? What was the sort of the spark and drive to start NotiSphere?
Yep. This was actually, it's interesting. The kickoff of all this, or the day that I just decided, okay, this is something that definitely I need to start spending time on and figuring out if I can solve, was I can still remember the meeting at which it happened. It was a meeting I was volunteering, doing some work to come up with recommendations to the FDA to improve the recall process. And I had volunteered just because I've dealt in supply chain healthcare for many years. And so I was in a room with suppliers and healthcare provider organizations looking at this process and understanding, seeing all of the pain points and asking a lot of questions, because I realized I'd worked with hospitals for 20 plus years, but I didn't really know anything about the supplier side of all this. And I suddenly understood that there was a lot more to it. But the more questions I asked, the more surprised I became. In essence, seeing this a process that hadn't changed in 40 plus years, while you and I and everybody else has evolved in how we operate and deal with things every day, this process is the same, hasn't changed, and more importantly, I realized everybody is feeling the pain from it, right? But so this light bulb was, and this is something that it has always pushed me, right? Which is, okay, big problem, it affects everybody, and yet you can actually apply one solution and solve all of these different challenges that are being described, right? So rather than going piecemeal, you have a chance to make a huge difference. And that day I walked out of that meeting thinking, somebody's going to do it, or somebody has to do it, I should say. So that's what pushed me, right? It was basically the idea of making a difference, but at a large scale.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a certain kind of almost like a aha moment. Sometimes it doesn't happen in all founding stories, but when you see sort of a pattern throughout history, and I also think it's seeing the people who are in this world, they don't know. They're not putting two and two together. They're not like, oh, if we build it API centric and web forward and blah, 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 then it'll be different. They're like, oh, that's just the way it is. But if you put something else in front of them, they would say, oh, let's do this. What is it exactly? What is the problem that you saw that was happening at the time?
So it's actually, I'll give you, there's one problem that really has multiple facets, if you will. But the problem is really, it boils down to data and communication between different parties involved in a common process that affects an entire industry. And so to not be too esoteric, right? What ends up happening is, in our case, hospitals are buying thousands of different products to treat patients, right? Anything from, as I like to say, a syringe to a bed to an MRI scanner, right? All sorts of different things, right? CAT scanner. And you would think, if you are involved in that industry, what you realize is any given hospital is buying tens of thousands of unique products. So people don't realize, as a patient, you only see a handful of things that you consider supplies. It could be bandages, it could be syringes, those kind of things, right? But when you really think about it, absolutely everything in the hospital is being bought to take care of patients. Pretty much almost anything in a hospital is also subject to being in a potential recall, right? Another one that probably a lot of people have heard about lately is, the CPAP machines that Philips has recalled recently, right? And everybody's talked about. But it could be anything. Literally, the recalls are happening constantly. The patients don't really hear about it, but it's something that the hospitals deal with. So when you think about this, you would think that this was an easy process. You'd go, okay, so somebody's bought supplies. The manufacturer will tell them that the supplies are in a recall. They'll execute on the recall. We're done, right? Nothing further from the truth. The process is incredibly more complicated than that for a multitude of reasons. But to visualize this, think about it this way. The supplier needs to tell the FDA who received the affected product, right? They need to file a communication plan to say, here's how I'm going to deal with letting the affected folks know. What they really know is where the product shipped to. They know where it went, right? It's not as easy as saying, I gave it to John Doe. It's more like, well, it went to this particular health system at this particular location, and it went to the receiving doc, or right, so, something like that. So they don't really have names. They typically have clients or locations where this stuff is received. The hospitals, on the other hand, operate in a totally different way, right? They want to coordinate recall actions to make sure that they're pulling all of the items from the shelf if they need to be pulled and not used on patients, etc. So what ends up happening is you have these two totally different sides of this marketplace that are not communicating properly because they don't see data the same way or operations the same way. They are all trying to take the steps to fix their issue without looking at it holistically, saying, well, there's probably a more efficient way to do this that would help the entire industry. And so when I sat down in this meeting and I started looking at this and I was hearing people suggest ways to improve the process, I kept saying, guys, it's a technology play. This is technology. You can solve this. And you could solve all of these issues with one single solution. And I couldn't get, like, folks would go, well, maybe with emails. I'm like, no. That has nothing to do with that. There's a way to use technology to enable communications to flow properly to the right people, the data be maintained the right way, right? And as I tried several times to explain it, and I realized it wasn't quite as clear to the folks I was talking to, that's when I realized, we need to solve it for them. And you just mentioned something that I totally subscribe to, right? Which is, at the end of the day, to make a big difference, you have to be thinking about the stuff that people are not thinking about. They don't even know they need to be thinking about it, right? That's how you help. That's how you become a good partner for folks, is help them understand what they're not thinking about, but they should be aware of.
Right.
That's what this is.
In that meeting, or in subsequent meetings similar to that, is the information transfer problem one in which the hospital wants to collect all the items from the shelves and then put them in a box and ship them, and then the company wants to receive that box? Are those kind of the two problems on either side, or something?
No. It's more upstream from there, right? So if you think about it, a supplier today needs to alert hospitals, clinics, physicians, all sorts of different types of provider entities that they've received items that are affected by a recall, right? The problem that you have is the only way they have of doing that is to basically FedEx everybody that received items, right? Now, that could mean that the same hospital gets 18 different FedExes for the same recall, right? They show up all over the place where these items were shipped to. That's not how the hospital wants to execute on recalls, on the other hand, right? The hospital has a need to coordinate centrally many times so that they can apply the right approach to this, right? The problem that you really have is in the industry, a lot of hospitals are not actually aware of the requirements the supplier has that they're trying to meet, right? At the same time, I will say the supplier is acutely unaware many times of the pain they're causing by sending all these FedExes everywhere, right? Interestingly, Mike, I think the key is they are both unaware because this is the process that's been followed for the last 40 years. And so it's become this, well, this is the way it is. Nobody's assuming that there could be such a disconnect.
Yeah.
Right? But there is. It's an enormous disconnect.
And the supplier just wants their products back, right? I mean, they're sending FedEx a letter or so, right? And then...
Yeah, they send a FedEx or a letter, certified letter. Normally, they're trying to do it as quickly as possible, obviously, to not affect patients. And it's, by the way, it's not always getting the items back, right? So a lot of times, what the FDA considers a recall could be what suppliers also call things like field service alerts, product advisory notes, right? Things that say, hey, this product requires attention. It could be a software update. It could be a change in the way the product needs to be used, right? So the instructions that a nurse needs to follow when using a product. It could be all sorts of different things. That doesn't necessarily mean stop using the product sometimes. It just means, you have to take either an action or achieve knowledge on this product, right? So in that regard, the issue is the supplier will send these notices and is requiring or is asking the providers to send an acknowledgement back so that they know that the provider is aware. But the process is I send a FedEx and I wait. Sometimes I wait a couple of months and then I send another FedEx if I haven't received an answer, right? Because I don't know exactly who to go to. And it keeps going. I mean, some recalls will have 6 waves of FedExes over a period of more than a year.
Wow.
Which is crazy when you think about it, right? Yeah, I mean, the more and more I dug into this problem, the more I couldn't believe. Because it was like, seriously? Like, you and I can buy a car online, can refinance a home, can close on a home. I've closed on a home remotely, right? Never even seen the sellers or the agents. And yet here we are with recall alerts having to be done this way. So I decided, okay, that doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so naturally I think, okay, so your approach is going to be have sort of a database of items that are attached to purchasers that then have a contact method attached to them. Is that?
No, it's different. It's basically what we did is we said, okay, if you look at the ultimate basic problem on each side or challenge on each side is on the supplier side, when you think about it, is the time to get a response back from the providers, from the right person at the hospital, right? Or clinic or wherever it is that they're sending the alert. And that's what's called compliance levels. Basically, how many people are responding back. There needs to be a number high enough to say, okay, we've satisfied the requirements, right? And on the provider side, it needs to be, am I actually getting a communication for a recall that I'm affected by? Because today what's happened is there's other third parties out there that cropped up over the years that decided to provide what we call a broadcasting of everything that's happening out on the market. Unfortunately, what that means is you get thousands of alerts that don't belong to you. But now you got to read them all and look at them all and try to figure out, right, what's what. So what we do is we're basically enabling a direct communication between these parties, right? We're just enabling. We're a platform. We don't maintain item information. In fact, this is where I think we become absolutely innovative from a perspective of attacking this problem in a way that nobody's ever looked at it this way before, right? Which is, hospitals get pretty surprised when I say, I don't need to tap into your purchase order history. I don't need to look at what you bought at all, right? They go, well, how are you going to? I go, because I don't need to look at your data to listen to the guy that's going to tell me that you're affected by the
right.
recall.
You have it on the other side. You know that they received what they received because you have the manufacturer.
Exactly.
Right?
The most accurate data you can find.
Right.
And so in that regard, we save time. We get more accurate, right? I mean, when you look at today, I'll give you an example. Pediatric hospitals today are affected by about 4% of all of the recall alerts they receive via their current methods. So that means they could be receiving 4,000 recall alerts in a year, and they're only needing to deal with a couple of hundred.
Well, it's a lot of
a
lot of noise, and with that noise, I'm sure there's just a lot of missed actionable, necessary actionable items that aren't being recalled. Okay, I'm with you. So the manufacturer, the vendor, I guess you'd call them, they're coming to you and they're saying, they view you as an alternative to the FedEx. So they say, our goal is to have this. They really want a communication back saying, thumbs up, we made this change, all good. And you're providing do you measure your success on the rate at which you're providing a better confirmation response compared to the FedEx?
Yeah, if you think about it, today what ends up happening is the supplier has a very lengthy cycle to do recalls, right? Because of what I just explained, they send the FedEx what we call the first wave, and they wait, then they send a second wave to anybody that hasn't responded, etc. What we also learned, by the way, which was mind-blowing to me, is a lot of times there's poor reconciliation between the responses. I don't know if it's a timing issue or what, but people that do respond to that alert still get a whole bunch of FedExes coming back again, right? So that frustrates hospitals as well. But more importantly, think about it from a timing perspective. If you're a supplier and you send these FedExes out, but you're not sure if the hospital's aware or not. Let's talk about, say, implantables, right? Every day that goes by is critical, because if you're having to pull those items and not use them on patients, every day that hospital is unaware that implantable is affected, that means potentially they have surgery scheduled and they're going to implant it in a patient. And then you're looking at explants and, all these different things, right? So that happens. Additionally, what we provide is an ability for the supplier to understand in real time when somebody is already aware of the recall. So there's no more waiting 2 months, right? The minute that a provider says, I acknowledge I've just received this, I may not have acted on it yet, but I'm aware of it. The supplier sees that in real time, right? So that's huge. And then the other piece is they can also see in real time the actions that the provider is taking. So suppliers can actually, this is a two-way real-time communication platform. So if a supplier is saying, tell me how many units you found on the shelf that are affected that you still had so that I can replace them, for example. The provider can go online on our platform and say, I found 16, here's the serial numbers, and if they need a destruction certificate or some other kind of document, they can upload that as well, right? And it's all kind of done real time. So that speeds up the process immensely. Saves a lot of patient risk as well, obviously.
Yeah, it does really hit home when I'm sure in those examples of an implant, especially if they have to pull it out of somebody, just the agony that person would have to go through knowing that this is a preventable issue, it's just a communication problem, is super frustrating. And not to mention the cost that goes into it on the hospital side.
For sure. Also think about the additional kind of ripples on the operations of the hospital, right? For every time that happens, a surgeon is now consulted to see, is it worth explanting or not, right? I always use the example of if you just did a hip implant on an 85-year-old patient, and the recall's being carried out because that hip implant might have an issue 15 years from now. Obviously, the surgeon might likely will say, well, there's more risk in bringing this patient back into the OR than just letting him be or letting her be, right? But that means the surgeon now needs to make that educated decision. And that's time also for surgeons, right? And for other staff. So the consequences and the inefficiency that today we suffer in this whole process is huge when you think about it.
So interesting. My wife is actually a pediatric orthopedic surgeon. So she probably
there you go.
Annoyed, among many other things, by that. Is this pervasive across the whole country? I guess domestically is as far as you're likely looking now, but I imagine it's the same everywhere in the U.S. at least.
Yeah, it's nationwide. It's actually global. When you think about it, I think it's about, don't quote me totally on this number because I'm pulling it out of my memory banks, but I think it's 65% of all of the recalls that we have here are global, right? It's at a number close to that, which means at the end of the day, these suppliers need to also communicate with, Europe and Asia and, Australia, whatever, right? But I'll tell you, specifically pediatrics, since you have it close at home, they suffer this problem a lot because the supplies that pediatric hospitals consume are obviously very focused, right? They're very specific. And so when these current alerts that are being sent out today by other means that are kind of repetitors, if you will, broadcasters of these things, they basically eliminate some information in the sense that they're communicating to everybody, whether you're affected or not. So if it's a batch or lot specific recall, they at that point have no way of knowing that. They're just going to, they're sending it out to everybody. And that's what ends up having unfortunately on a pediatric hospital, most of the recalls are not theirs. It doesn't affect them, right?
Yeah.
The inefficiencies are enormous when you think about it. It's just, what I think happens too, Mike, is this is not, I always say, this kind of stuff is not sexy, right? This is not the stuff that makes the news and has stories that the media wants to write about or whatever. But it does have a lot of, I mean, it has a huge effect on patients, right? I mean, at the end of the day, there are people behind this at the end of it all, right? When somebody walks into a hospital, and this is a true case that happened years ago, right? Unfortunately, and there's plenty like this, but to get treated, and they're supposed to use an infusion machine, and the nurses at the hospital don't know that machine has been recalled more than a month ago, and they put it on this patient, and that thing fails, and the poor patient dies. That's a consequence, right? That guy didn't have to die, at least not from an overdose from a machine like that, right? It could have been prevented. And it took them days afterwards to find out that the machine had been recalled. It wasn't even immediate.
True story, that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure it happens. Wow. Yeah.
There's a few. Yeah.
That's pretty fascinating and terrifying. So is the financial incentive, how does the business model work? I see the clear financial incentive on the hospital side. Is that the way that you charge for it, a subscription, or how do you?
No, we actually don't charge providers. We don't charge hospitals, right? And for me, that is a principle of fairness. The way I would put it is if you went to a BMW dealership to buy a car, and the sales guy there told you, by the way, you need to pay extra in case BMW recalls this car, to be notified.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Would you buy the car, or would you just say, I'm buying a Mercedes now? There's no way I'm paying for this, right?
It's not their fault. Right.
It's not. Absolutely not. In fact, what we do is we charge suppliers, but we actually allow them to save a ton load of money, right? Because we're a hell of a lot cheaper than FedExing tens of thousands of locations.
That's true, actually.
So at the end, everybody wins.
So what does a FedEx typically cost? Like $3 to send that out?
Oh, no. If you're doing overnights today, that could be anywhere from 15 to 22 bucks.
Multiplied by
per envelope, so
so if you take, let's look at it as per provider level. So if you took a hospital like maybe a 500-bed hospital in a major city, they have tens of thousands of products. You said 96% of the FedExes they're receiving are noise. So that means, right? Tell me if that's right.
No. Okay, so Mike, so what happens is this: when they receive a FedEx today, that FedEx means they're affected. Okay. They're affected by the recall. Okay. What ends up happening is about 15 years ago or so, maybe a little more than that, a few solutions propped up on the market that basically said, let me give you, just in case, so that you don't miss on anything, let me give you a feed of every recall that's out there so that you at least know, right? You're going to do everything you can to make sure that you don't ever miss anything. That sounds like a great idea. The intention is great, obviously, right? The intention was or is to prevent anybody from missing on a recall. But that was done when there were about 300 recalls a year in the country. In the last 5 years, the number of recalls has exploded, right? So now you're looking at thousands a year. And so that model doesn't work anymore, because what happens is now you're being told every time there's a recall, which is, every day, right? Every day there's recalls coming in. Most of them don't affect you because they're batch, lot specific, etc. But these guys are sending all of it. Unfortunately, what's happened years ago is hospitals were trying, like I mentioned, to coordinate in a standardized fashion, right? And so they used these electronic feeds as an input. Well, today that input has become an absolute frustration source, right? So the FedExes, on the other hand, if you're looking at cost, are still an enormous cost when there is a recall for a supplier. I'll give you examples. When an item is highly distributed, let's say syringes, and there has been some of these, right? And there's a nationwide recall, you could be looking at 170,000 FedExes or 200,000 FedExes for the first wave.
God, that's insane. Right? So that might be
well over
$1 million.
For sure. And by the time you're done with several waves, you're looking at, and that's only in communications, right? That has nothing to do with sending you products or anything else. It's just the communication piece, which is what we're dealing with. It can get pretty high up there.
Okay, wow. So right. That's staggering. And you said the electronic method of receiving the recall notifications through the EHR or however they're receiving electronically, it's just overwhelmed because they're receiving way too many to practically process efficiently?
Yeah, yeah. The way I see it is, and what providers tell us, right, is, when you're obviously you've set up a process now that says, okay, I'm going to have to look at everything that comes in, and then I got to figure out, did I buy it or not, right? And you could do some programmatic approaching to reports on that, but as you know, there's special order items. There's all sorts of stuff that you could deal with that kind of fall through the cracks, and so you got to really be careful, right? But the worst part, the way I look at it is, it's the human factor, right? It's the guy or gal that's been looking at recalls all week. They've looked at 100 of them or 150 of them. Only 2 affected them. And now it's Friday afternoon and they're late to go to Timmy's, school function or whatever. And by no mean do I, by no way do I mean to bash anybody. I love people that work at hospitals because the dedication is just insane, right? But we're all human. And one day that white noise and that alert fatigue kicks in and you just don't do that thorough of a job, or you're tired and you miss it, right? Or so for me, it's all about, can we get an accurate process that's efficient, a lot quicker than what we do today, cheaper overall for the industry when you think about it, right? And that saves patients. And if we can accomplish all that, then why would we not do it?
Totally. I'm with you. Okay, so the business model is, and so how do you charge the vendors? Is it on a per message or per recall level?
No, we do. We have a different approach to that. It's a little bit more general, but it always makes sense to the supplier, right? Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, what you got to think about is what we're trying to do is solve industry problems. And in order to do that, I honestly think you can't show up by just saying, I'm just going to cost you more, or I'm just going to add cost to a process. I don't think, I think when you look at it, even what humanity has done worldwide, right, over history, I think it's become pretty clear that whether we like it or not, financials are always the incentive to get people moving. And so if you put an incentive that really isn't, but it's more of a hurdle, then things don't work, right? Yeah. So in that regard, I think we're well positioned in that we're solving a problem by achieving savings and making it appealing to suppliers and providers.
I think I'm following you. So you're charging the vendors a quoted price per. Maybe I'm not. So
it's. I mean, rather than get into the specifics of how we do it with the supplier itself, what you just have to see is, if I can save dollars to a supplier today based on what they spend on recalls. But more importantly, think about it this way, right? It's not even about that, although that's obviously a great enabler. It's about making their clients happy.
That's a big part of it, yeah.
Right?
And ideally, they don't send all these FedExes. Like, just the sheer number of paper being delivered and the impact on all these trucks driving around, and like, do you need $1 million worth of paper going out if you can do it digitally? It would seem like that's
right. We calculated how many trees get chopped every year because of paper recall alerts, and it's more than 500,000.
Jesus, you should put that. That should be front and center on your website, man. You need to put that on your website somewhere.
It's phenomenal. I mean, and think about it. That doesn't even account for things like the carbon footprint of the FedEx airplanes and the trucks, like you were mentioning, all this stuff, right? Just the paper alone, 500,000 trees.
You should put that on your site. You should derive the impact of CO2. For real, I think because ultimately what you're doing is you're improving the efficiency of communication by going from old school driving with paper to digital communication. And that is relevant for customers. I mean, people make decisions based on many different motivations that they have. Certainly the cost savings is the most obvious. Then there's the customer satisfaction. But then I think it's also for a hospital or a vendor, if they can say, hey, we're now using this digital communication, it's something that they can use in their marketing material. And if you can say, hey, 500,000 trees are 50 million grams of CO2.
It's funny that you say this, and I'm going to show some of my team your words because when I say it in our internal discussions, I do have some folks that go, "Listen, I get it. You live in California. You're all about hugging trees and everything." And I'm like, "Yes, I am. I actually do care about the environment. So do millions of people every day." And it is a motivation, right? It is a motivator for a lot of people. Some folks in my team go, we like it. We don't believe everybody's on board with this. And I'm going, well, I'm sure the guy that's saying that climate change is not real maybe doesn't care. I don't know, but maybe they do. What I do know is the people that I deal with every day do care.
Yeah.
I care deeply, right? I got 3 daughters. I sure as hell want to make sure my kids can grow up in an environment that's not absolutely destroyed, right? So if I can do something to help that, I'm doing it.
It's only, regardless of where we are today, we're headed in one direction. I mean, we're moving towards digital communication, away from cutting down trees to print paper, to drive them in internal combustion engine cars. Like that model is going to experience increased pressure as the world both becomes more aware of the climate change impacts, but also just the regulatory climate, the cultural climate. So yeah, I think if you become known as that, that's a pretty powerful thing, because quickly these vendors are going to they're going to feel the pressure to say, okay, so what is your recall policy? How do you do it? It's an expensive process,
and I'll tell you, even today, I know for a fact that suppliers, when they deal with the group purchasing organizations in healthcare, for example, have already started a few years ago to be asked about sustainability, and they're evaluated on that, right? So their business wins, if you will, in some bids and other contracting processes, already have an effect on it by things like sustainability. Are you using recycled how much of your product is recycled materials? What's your carbon footprint? What kind of chemicals are you using? Right? Those kind of things. So I agree with you. I think it's getting there. It's going to be, and I think it's growing at an exponential rate. Right? It's become we're all becoming a lot more aware very quickly about these things now. Right? I mean, I don't know you, but if I'm grocery shopping, I'm reading labels constantly.
Yeah,
right?
the first impact is you see it in cities. You live in LA. I lived in LA. It's the smog. 30. When was the smog really bad? In the 70s or so? They really.
Yeah, it was. You couldn't see 10 feet away.
Right, so it becomes just so obvious that you have no choice but to solve it, and then it becomes, then you solve it locally in the city, and then we have sort of a global. Similar situation, but it's difficult to see in the early days, and now it just becomes more obvious through, all the ways, ice caps, the sea levels, the temperatures, and so that becomes very obvious, and then we all say, okay, now we actually have to do something about it, which is why that movie Don't Look Up was so popular. It touches on this exact concept. It's like you can ignore something when it's abstract and sort of theoretically scientific, but then when it's like in the sky headed to you, you have no choice.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. Yeah, I do think, overall, I think the collective consciousness, I think we could agree, is much more aware today, right? Like, at the same time, it's interesting to see how financial incentives, in some cases, will slow the effort, right? So that's why I was calling the financial pieces just don't cause a hurdle, while you get other incentives like patient safety, environmental aspects, et cetera, right? Or even just peace of mind from the folks that work at a hospital.
No, this is the exciting part, to be sitting in your seat when you're solving a problem that frankly should have been solved 15, 20 years ago. It becomes just a screaming problem today, which I'm sure contributes to your growth. Where are you guys now in terms of money raised and people on the team, and how you measure progress?
So we've started generating revenue. We finalized a seed round in December of 2021. So we've done 2 rounds in the last 2 years, which makes me incredibly proud of the team, right? Because when you think about it, being able to pull something like this off in the middle of COVID, dealing with healthcare supply chain, It's crazy, right? I mean, when COVID hit, the ability for supply chain staff at a hospital to focus on anything that wasn't just acquiring supplies was almost zero, right? And so for us, we actually took that as a great opportunity to say, okay, guys, listen, I told my team, don't call on hospitals right now. There's no point, right? We don't want to add to the stress. So we're not high up in the priority at this point. At this point, they need to get masks and gowns and, all this stuff that was increasingly more difficult to find. Let's focus internally and start building a stronger solution with all of the stuff we've already learned and know. And that's what we did. What ended up happening, though, was fascinating to me. So for about 6 months or 8 months, we just basically looked inward, right, and just went to work. After that, we started seeing hospitals reach out to us. And the reason for it, Mike, which is, it's kind of the silver lining, I guess. It's the blessing of this terrible thing that we've suffered for a couple of years now, right? Which is supply chain has become a very strategic area for hospitals. And if you think about it, historically, supply chain was not considered that by the C-suite. It was more of I used to joke, and not necessarily to make fun of that, but we used to say, okay, yeah, supply chain always gets relegated to the basement, and it's all about just cutting costs, and nobody cares much more about anything but that. Today, supply chain has become a very strategic discussion at the C-suite, right? Because it can impact a multitude of aspects of a business and their ability to actually care for patients. So we started getting calls from the hospitals basically saying, hey, we're starting to talk about what steps do we take to avoid or to enhance, supply chain resiliency in our hospital. And if you think about it, at the end of the day, a recall is nothing more than supply disruption. That's all it is, right? So we've now become a very strategic part of that resilience discussion. Think about it this way. When a hospital today gets a notice of a recall, and they end up getting the recall notice 3 weeks late, right? By the time they need to figure out what alternative items to use, or how do they solve the fact that now they can't use the supplies they have, it's too late. Because the suppliers today are not accepting new customers most of the times, right? The supply chains are maxed out. So these providers now are canceling surgeries and don't know where to find the product this is happens every week. So for them, being able to be alerted immediately, and not even that, but maybe even, hey, it's immediate and here's an alternative product or whatever, right? It's key. So in that regard, I think we've now gotten an enormous amount of traction, and I think we're doing really well. It's a process, right? Because at the end, our solution is not a solution that sells to one account at a time, for example, and just you deal with that. You're bringing everybody to the table. You have to bring everybody to the table, right? Which is what we're doing. But I think we're in a good spot. I think we're doing well.
Yeah. Are you guys looking at further funding rounds in the future, in the short term?
We will. We've got plans. I mean, right now we just finished this one and we're doing pretty good. But and I have to say, I'm incredibly happy with the investors we have backing us. They're just rock solid folks. They've been incredibly supportive. They have a ton load of knowledge. Some of them even have knowledge in the medical device manufacturer management space. So, I think we're blessed. I think we've done really well. We are, looking at scaling this obviously at a pretty fast pace. If you think about it, the beauty of what we do is we're system agnostic, right? We're not connected or tied, if you will, to a particular ERP or to a particular EHR or to a particular brand of anything, right? We need to be agnostic so that we can solve this problem for the entire industry.
Yeah, that's such a strength. It's such a. I mean, I raised $23 million, ran a healthcare company for 4 years, and struggled all the time with the integration with hospitals, so much so that we ended up moving away from hospitals entirely. And this is after we raised money from Cedars-Sinai. Like we went through the Techstars Healthcare Accelerator, and it was always like you're either in the fast lane, meaning you do not need the hospitals to do anything, or you're like, oh, I got to integrate to this EHR and this API. And there's a lot of successful companies that do take that approach, but it is so much slower. And you just have
it is quicksand. Yeah. So a couple of things, Mike. First, as you probably know, we have Cedars is one of our investors, the Cedars Accelerator. We were selected to their 2019 accelerator year. Love them. I have nothing but warmth and a special place in my heart for the entire team at Cedars-Sinai. They've been phenomenal. Anybody from the accelerator and everybody, all of the staff from the hospital, right, the medical center, folks in surgery, pharmacy, clinical engineering, supply chain, you name it. I mean, it's just a phenomenal organization with a great culture. I just love them. I do agree with you, too, that integration with systems, especially now when hospitals are incredibly paranoid about all of the stuff that's happening with phishing scams and folks blocking their systems, right, and asking for Bitcoin to open it up and all that stuff. They've gotten really paranoid about it, which is understandable. The beauty of what we're doing, though, Mike, is we don't need to integrate with anything.
Yeah.
I don't need to plug it into an EHR or an EMR or an ERP or anything. It's a SaaS offering that, we literally have had sites with health systems with tens and tens of sites up and running in a couple of, 2 days.
No, it makes
it
makes total sense to me. I mean, it's a clear problem. You're offering a clear solution in a vague world. Are there other opportunities that you've seen, just out of curiosity, spark people who are listening's interest behind the scenes? I always feel like in healthcare, there's a really big graveyard of companies on the front end consumer side. People see a problem, they're like, oh, well, we can make healthcare better in this way.
Right.
And then I also believe that there's a enormous opportunity to improve healthcare on the back end. The way money flows, the way logistics works, supply chain in your case, right. Workers, payments. Are there other things that you've seen that feel like big problems in the space that if you could wave a magic wand, that you could solve in healthcare?
I think there are, for sure, right? And I'll, probably I would say there's good opportunities on the financing side or on the financing aspect of our healthcare system itself, right, and how everything works. And I talk about what I'm talking about really is not so much the transactional stuff, but rather more the principle stuff and how things get applied. Right. So, if you think about it, most people today would tell you, we have the best probably delivery of care in the world, right? And the best clinical ability to deliver that care. And then the finance side of things is where everything the rest of the world are looking at us going, what are those guys doing?
What do you think the source of this problem is?
I think at the end, what ends up happening is you have a lot of stakeholders, and they all obviously have incentives and they all have things that they're chasing, right? And so aligning all of it to end up with the most efficient outcome for everybody or for the industry as a whole is not easy at all, right? So, and I know that if I talk about things like universal healthcare, there's going to be a whole bunch of people that just start screaming, right? So I'm not necessarily advocating for one thing or the other, but I do think that right now we're trying to fix things even now, right? There's these intents to fix, or the law that just got passed to fix the surprise bills and stuff like that, right? But when you really think about it, surprise bills should never have existed. Like, how could you possibly be going in as a patient when a hospital has told you we're in network and your surgeon's in network and everything's fine, and then you get a bill for $4,000 because the anesthesiologist is not in network, and you had no idea who that guy is, right? You get no choice. So those are things that I think have fixes that are also not easy. or immediate, but it's about there are opportunities to solve them. I would say, Mike, that the key difference is this: we see a lot, and I appreciate your words. Right, there's a graveyard of startups that start in the patient side of things because that's what people experience, and so when they experience something that they feel could be improved, they're going to go at it. Right. On the back end of things, what you need is people that have spent many years working in that environment, understanding all of the gotchas, to then figure out, how do I solve this, right? Because at the end of the day, you are going to have all sorts of stakeholders you need to bring along.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the easiest trap to fall into, right? You come up with a solution, but half the people that are involved in the process don't see it your way, right? They're not seeing it. And so
I agree. Right? I agree with that. You'd need a couple thoughts. If you're going to go in and sort of with an entrepreneurial attitude and kind of like surgically intervene into the existing healthcare system to make a change, you're likely walking through a maze of regulations. And I mean, from an outsider's perspective now, I believe that if you look at like what makes the United States different categorically from other countries in the developed world, why are we three times higher per capita and the expenses with vastly questionable results. I mean, like on every level. It's certainly, like you said, it's certainly not our technical capability from the doctors and the nurses and the actual providers themselves. It is the back office flow of funds and the financial incentives. My view is that after World War II in 1942, when Roosevelt passed the act to cap wages, after the war we had tremendous inflation, and they wanted to cap the wages of people. And at that time, the car companies were the big companies in the space. And so executives said, okay, we can't pay you any more than that. We're going to offer you health care. And the health care became like a standard offering for people that they're trying to recruit. And now all of a sudden you have this like momentum of healthcare being intertwined with employers because of some regulation that some guys thought was a good idea. And then we associate employers with health insurance. Think about, you don't associate employer with car insurance or any other insurance, but with healthcare insurance.
Agreed.
And so that just steamrolls and grows momentum. Then there's like incentives and the government doubles down on this bad decision, in my view. And today we have a situation where the person paying for the product, healthcare, is not receiving the value. And that is the person paying, the employer is not receiving any value. The person receiving it is the person. And so it's like the worst of both worlds, where if you took a purely like centralized approach and said the government's going to manage everything, you'd have consistent, probably you can control the cost. It would be low quality. I mean, it would be long wait times. You see this in countries that do have this approach, like Canada's has this kind of approach. And then on the flip side, if you had pure free market where everyone just purchases their own insurance, then you run into situations where people don't buy insurance. And so what do you do morally if someone blows their leg off and they don't have insurance? Like, are we a society that says, oh, I'm cool with that. Oh, you don't have insurance? Sorry, can't help you. Like car insurance, we have no problem saying, oh, you broke your car? Sorry, you're out the money for the car. But
so think about it this way. Yeah. No, I'm following you 100%, right? But think about it this way. So a couple of things, because I grew up in Spain, and obviously we have universal healthcare over there, just like they do in France or Italy, right? And I would say you are right. Some surgeries you'll have to wait. They typically are the elective ones. I mean, things that are not life-threatening, right? So in other words, if you need open heart surgery because you're basically dying, they're not going to put you on a waiting list saying it's a 6-month wait. Let's hope you make it, right? That doesn't happen. Now, if you need a hip implant, they could say, well, you probably can wait 3 months or 4 months until there's availability, etc. With that said, I'll also tell you that most of the countries where you have universal healthcare also have private insurance. A lot of people actually buy bolt-on insurance. You don't get it from employers, right? You're buying it yourself. Okay? I used to have that. I was fortunate enough that my family had means in Spain, and we had universal health care, right? That's what we call the Social Security, is when we say Social Security in Spain, you're talking about universal health care, right? And you also had the ability to buy private insurance so that when you did want an elective surgery and you didn't want to wait at all, you could just go that route, right? So that's one thing. What I will tell you is, and I 100% with you in that this whole concept of tying healthcare insurance to employers, to me, is mind-boggling. How many conversations have you had with people over the years where you hear somebody say, "Listen, I'd love to change jobs right now, but I'm not going to because..."
All the time,
right?
All the time,
right? So at the end, when you really think about it, that's terrible but at the end of the day, you could say, well, if employers, instead of paying for the health insurance, just gave that extra money as part of your salary, maybe, with some tax arrangement by law, then people could just buy their own insurance or do something, or, and you wouldn't be tied to an employer necessarily. You could just move around because the salaries then would have their own kind of regulating effect, right? That's one thing. The other thing that I would point out, Mike, and this is something that I don't think a lot of people think about here, but it's true. We don't have universal health care officially in the U.S., but when you think about it, by the time you're done looking at how many people have coverage through the VA, Medicare, Medicaid, etc., you're probably talking about 70% of the people already that need coverage, right? I mean, or 50. I don't know what the number is exactly, but it's certainly high. So at the end, you kind of go, listen, the only ones that really don't have it are the hardworking folks that are paying their taxes every day and going to work and that are kind of moving this machine in some way, right? It's I hate to stereotype because I don't know, the ages can be all over the place, right? But it's like, okay, get the middle-aged 40-something-year-old guy, right? That guy's working, paying his taxes, paying for the premiums, doing all this stuff, and he has no ability to land into any of these universal coverages, right? So clearly the financial of all that is a little messed up. Do I have the answer to that? No, well, not at all.
Tell me if you agree with this, though. I think you can I think you can rationally walk through not to say that this is the answer, but it is the way I think it makes sense to think about the problem. So I would think employers, whether an employer is involved in healthcare, not critical. I would think, what are the absolutes in this situation? Absolute is, regardless of insurance, if somebody walks into a hospital with an urgent critical health issue, they will be taken care of. So I think we have to satisfy that need. B, if you are mentally unable, you're psychologically not with it enough, you're covered. If you are physically unable to work in the world, you're covered. And if you're old, you're covered. So so this is another one. If you're poor, if you don't have enough money to get some very basic thing, we got you. So I think those are the categories of people that we want to provide the access to at least basic sustaining healthcare services. This is not redoing your plastic surgery kind of thing. It's not like elective optional things, but it's like critical things. And then I think, okay, then those people, if you looped all those together, it's not even just old, it's old and poor. Because if you're old and wealthy, well, you still have the potential. Sometimes you can be old and not psychologically there if you're experiencing dementia or Alzheimer's. So, but my grandmother is 90 years old. She has money. She should be playing the game just like everyone else is, so to speak, entering into the economy. So then I think, okay, so what does it look like? Why does insurance need to be involved with the government or employers at all? If you took the 80% or 85% of people that are not in one of those buckets and say, you guys, there's just insurance companies out there. They're going to have oversight by the government, but they're just going to be innovative and creative and entrepreneurial and competitive and free market. Go at it. Then all the providers, they do their thing. There's rating services, there's reviews, places you can see. Sure, some people are going to get surgeries from somebody who says they're not great and it ends up being a bad surgery. They write a scathing review, and that's how the market balances out. You have to have some price that you pay to get accurate transparency into any product or service that's out there. So
if you think about it, Mike, that the parallelism I see with what we're doing with recalls is this. What we have today is a process for that's been ingrained in our society now for decades, right? Like you said, I mean, it started after World War II, and here we are, right, in 2022. And so it doesn't change overnight, right? What you need is somebody to come up with a very innovative, totally different way to look at the problem. That person or that group of people will also have a different challenge, which is to start bringing people along to buy into the idea and to then be the trendsetters and kind of burn that path, right? Because as you know, I mean, if it was as easy as pressing an easy button, coding some software and sitting back and letting it work, everybody, we wouldn't be here today doing that.
I wonder,
right?
Why do you think, though, that we as in society in America can't agree bipartisan that we can remove the mandatory requirement that employers provide health insurance? If you just said, hey, optional employers, if you don't want to, you don't have to, you can pay your employees more, they can go buy it elsewhere. Right. It seems so easy.
I don't know. I mean, to be honest with you, it's not an area that I know a lot of at all, right? I haven't spent time in the insurance side of things. But I would think that what happens today is you have a lot of interests and incentives from different stakeholders in the industry that prevent that in some way, right? Or that make it very difficult for that to happen. No different than with any other industry or with any other important topic where you're going to have lobbies or you're going to have things like that, right? So I think at the end, that's why I'm saying. For something to change, everybody that's involved in that process today needs to get a cookie somehow.
Yeah.
Right. Somehow they need to be able to see something good for them, right, in it, or else it doesn't work. I don't believe in just hammering people with a stick to get things to work, because it doesn't. Eventually, what people will do is try to figure out a way around it. Rather than, right, the human psyche of saying, you're not going to force me, is a very powerful one.
And I think it has to become an issue, just like I think cryptocurrency has elevated the sophistication of the dialogue around currency and economic principle decisions and policy. The same thing has to happen in healthcare, where the average level of intellectual sophistication of citizens we have to up-level that in order for people to see through the facade. Like if a large insurance company gives a bunch of money to a politician and the politician's like, we're fighting for healthcare for everybody. And it's like, well, you're really just fighting to keep the insurance company who provides little value in business. And it's like this leech on this whole system. It's like no value added, money sucking out of it. And then people have to be able to see, likely through these kind of conversations, frankly, like it's not going to be mainstream media. It's going to be sophisticated dialogues that people tune into. And it's like, oh, okay, let's think about how money moves around and think about incentive structures. And then it starts to change.
I'll tell you, though, I totally agree. I do think, though, I don't look at insurance companies necessarily as a bad thing. I think the key is every stakeholder today in the industry has a role and can have a role in a future process that works well, right? But it's a little bit like, it's no different than looking at Wall Street and saying, hey, some companies are doing stock buybacks and other things, right? And people get upset about that. And you go, well, you're incentivizing their C-suite based on the stock price. So if you do that, why wouldn't they do this? If the guy is going to make $12 million in bonuses because the stock goes up, you've just, that board has set that in place for that team to do that. We shouldn't be surprised, right? Now, there's other, if what we want is to achieve something different, there's other ways of doing that as well, right? You can line up the right incentives and things will happen. And that happens with any stakeholder, any entity, any player, So I do like the fact that these discussions are happening more and more, right? Discussions like the one you and I are having right now are happening a lot. They're happening on the water cooler, around the water cooler in the office, right? Which is great. I think these were things that maybe 20 years ago.
And I think it's important too for people to take a stand that they can understand it. A lot of people would I think of the parallel in finance where, I accumulate money in my 30s or 40s and I don't know where to spend it. Let me go hire a financial planner and let them make decisions. Now the younger generations, like your 2030s, millennial, Gen Z, are thinking, no, I'm not hiring someone. Like I'm going to go and invest it myself.
I'll take care of it myself.
And Wealthfront and all these crypto investments. And so I think the same thing, this trend is hopefully, pervasive across healthcare too, where it's like, no, let's think about this from our first principles level. Like what's going on? It's only super, super complex because we have 70,000 rules that we invented out of nowhere. Like the first principle is broke my leg. I need a doctor to come fix it. And, there's a building that I need to go to. I got to pay them somehow. Like start from that level of sophistication and then add other rules.
No. Right. It's true. I do think that, the average person now is certainly much more interested and involved in the discussion and in reading about things, and has, a lot of them have opinions about, well, here's what's not working, or at least they definitely can explain what's not working for them.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that the COVID has also invited in people to learn more about healthcare, and healthcare, it's such a big part of the economy that it's not like we're not talking about, roofing on houses or some small part of the economy. It's like, it's such a big part that there's a huge incentive for a lot of people to learn. So yeah, man.
Yeah. Well, it becomes very important once, one of your relatives is in the hospital.
Or you have to pay that bill.
Or has an emergency.
Yeah.
That too.
Well, hey, man, congrats on all the progress. I enjoyed hearing about the business, and thank you for entertaining me on going down the rabbit hole of healthcare policy. I wish you the best on everything. Are you writing or tweeting, or is there any shout outs you want to give?
You know what? We do have a few things. Mostly we show up on LinkedIn. We participated on a power supply podcast, and they got an expert series we're writing about. So we tend to publish over there or on our website. We don't do a lot of Twitter. We have an account, but we're not too active yet. That might change soon, I guess. We're staying away from things like Facebook and other stuff like that, because it's really, that's more, I think that's more, you would think that's more for patients, right? At the patient level and stuff. But yeah, we're active. We do, I think more and more, what you're going to see is white papers and other things that are coming out now based on the stuff we've been doing. And by the way, Mike, it's been a pleasure, being invited over and talking about this stuff. I love, seeing people as passionate as I am about these topics, because it's
cool,
always
man.
great.
Keep crushing it. Take care.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Take care.